Hey everyone, last week for my podcast, Griffin and I were able to interview film and television composer Mark Isham about one of his new projects. And in the process, we were able to kind of ask him about whatever we wanted to ask him about. And he just happened to be the composer of one of my absolute favorite movies of the last decade, Warrior. So we spent almost 10 minutes talking with him about working on sports movies, and then I got to ask him about Warrior in particular, and I had a bunch of questions about both the score, the soundtrack, that whole process. It was just a real pleasure and delight to get to have the experience of asking those questions. So here's a little clip from that. You can see the entire podcast over on my main channel. The link is down below, up above, at the end of all of this stuff. You can see the whole 40-minute section, but here's a clip from me getting to talk with him about one of my favorite movies of all time.
But I do want to switch gears a little bit here and move into a genre that you're pretty much the go-to guy, I would imagine, for this genre, which is sports films. So like you scored a number of sports movies from like The Express to Miracle, which is personally my favorite sports film of all time, Warrior, and so I'm curious for you, kind of having done a number of them and understanding what makes a good one work. What is the key to like truly unlocking the sound for a great sports score?
That's a good question. It's I think it's understanding that sports, and this is funny because I never played sports as a young man. I am the least athletic person you can imagine. However, I have three sons, all of whom played sports. Two of them played college football, and one of them made it into the Pac-12 and was on television.
Wow.
So I have, in my family experience, a lot of big-time sports. So as I've observed it in film and in life, sports sort of bring together that human experience that we've experienced, throughout the evolution of the human race of going to war, having a side that you believe in, protecting that side, teamwork of that side to go and win the battle. And I think that's such an archetypal emotion that we have just as a culture been through, even though in our generation we haven't experienced that personally. But it's part of our culture. It's such a huge part of our culture. And I think it's why sports are so popular, is because we get to relive and be a part of the adrenaline and the excitement and the emotion of that fundamental part of our global culture. And I think if you understand how to represent that in music, and I just thought of this because you're the first person that's really sort of probed this question to this degree, but I think Gustav Mahler, the German composer who I was introduced to as a very young child by my parents, has the ability to represent that in his symphonies. And maybe the fact that I grew up listening to my mother listen to those symphonies just ingrained that sense of what it is for music to express triumph, the bitterness of defeat, the rising up from the ashes to go back and win in the fourth quarter. What emotions are, right? And how archetypal they are. And it's fun as hell to do too. It's really you can stir people's souls and you can get grown men to cry. And if you can that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know Sean can speak to this.
So
I think Sean's favorite sports film. Yeah, exactly. You're Warrior.
Right, yeah. Speaking of grown men crying, Warrior is, top 3 movies for me of the last decade. And it does exactly what you just talked about, of so many emotions, the victory, but it's also this deep family drama. And a big part of that movie is the music. And that's the score, and it's incorporating Beethoven, and you've got the Nationals. What's the process of on that, like collaborating? Is it that music supervisor cut with Gavin O'Connor coming in to like give kind of this vision for how those pieces kind of come together?
Well, I've worked a lot with Gavin, and most of the time we've not had a music supervisor. Gavin does
Okay.
his
Oh,
homework.
interesting. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Gavin brought the National in. Gavin brings pretty much any song comes into his film. He's the one that's been driving around with playlist after playlist, listening and brings them in. The picture editor on Warrior, well, we went through quite a few, but John Gilroy ended up finishing the picture, and he's very musical as well, and he would put music in. And I made the unfortunate quip of, in that montage scene when they're training and Frank Grillo turns and says, listen to the Beethoven, listen to the Beethoven.
Which is my next question. About that.
I made the unfortunate quip of saying, I suppose we have to try Beethoven at some point so that we can decide not to do it, right? Definitely thinking we're going to decide not to do it. Well, of course, I tried it and it works fucking great.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So that completely went against any plan or any previously conceived idea that I had, but it latched onto the film and it's hung in there and it stayed to the bitter end.
And it ties into the story. I mean, it's a plot point, and I mean, so much of it. My question that I had written down was, did he come to you with Beethoven's Ninth and be like, "Hey, can you put Ode to Joy in the training montage?" But that's interesting the way that played out.
Well, they tried that. They tried the original, an orchestral recording in it, and that's when I said, yeah, well, that doesn't work, does it? And then Gavin, smart ass Gavin, he said, well, what about if you did something?
Yeah, he's like forcing you to come full circle with your childhood in a way.
Exactly. And thinking, of course, I'll just do this quickly. I'll bang it out in an afternoon or two, and we'll all agree that it doesn't work. And then, of course, oh my God, it's actually pretty great.
That's funny.
Another piece of music in that one that's interesting is the movie ends on the Nationals doing About Today, and the whole movie crescendos to this song. And but my understanding is that's a different version from what's on their album version. Was that something that you worked on this version of it, or is that something just they did entirely?
That's a very interesting point. It's a live version that they did on French radio in a radio studio. And this is where Gavin, again, I mean, he'd known the National, and he'd turned me on to the National years before. But he called me up and he said, look, I've got a National song. I said, okay, good. He said, no, I found this live version where the ending just goes on and it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds. And I know that this is the way that this film needs to end. So it was a bit of a legal thing, because not only did the National have to sign off, then they had to go to French radio. They had to discover who might own the actual master recording. They had to see if there was a better recording than this MP3 that he had. So that was the hardest part of all of that. And then we played it for the National. I remember we flew to New York, met with them, played them the scene, and they loved it. And I turned to them and I said, look, would you allow me to orchestrate once that build at the end goes, because I want the size of this thing to be able to match the score that we've had. And we've had some pretty big moments. And they said, yes, please, that would be fantastic. So once they get into that build, the orchestra comes in and just wraps itself around the National. And I don't disagree with you. It's maybe one of the top 3 films that I'm the most proud of.
Oh, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times my wife and I have rewatched it. And the way on my YouTube channel, that's the movie I recommend the most to people, because it's so underwatched and everyone that sees it loves it. So I did a big recommendation back in January, my best of the decade. Every single day, someone private messaged me, thank you so much for recommending Warrior. And I always say about the whole last hour of the movie is just nonstop, victory moments. And so much of that is just the score coming in at just the right time, those victory moments. And then that crescendo at the end is just, I can't think of any other movie that just crescendos so much on that final moment so well. So wonderful job. As I said, I love that movie, and you're a huge, gigantic part of that. Thank
you so much.
Thank you so much.